Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to the Roland JX-3P tutorial. This is the first of a couple of videos where I'm going to talk about this beautiful synthesizer, very sadly neglected in the historical annals of Roland synthesizers. And its two siblings that were also released in the 1980s have gone on to be far, far more successful than this one for very unfortunate and unfair reasons. We had the Jupiter in 81, the Juno in 82, two of the most famous synthesizers of all time, and the JX-3P in 1983. So you'd think with that kind of heritage behind it, why hasn't everybody heard of it? It's because basically people thought it was a toy. Have a look at how many buttons are on the front. If you compare this with a contemporary Juno, that had many more features and felt like a far more powerful synthesizer. What Roland failed to properly advertise was that they developed a standalone editor for this thing called the PG200, which unveiled a huge range of really powerful functions that actually made it more flexible, more powerful than the Juno with which it was competing. People saw it in the shop and just didn't know, and so didn't buy it. But it sounds absolutely beautiful. Here we've got a really simple electric piano, and it's just got everything that the Juno has, all of that thick, warm, analog loveliness. Architecturally, the Juno and the JX-3P were very similar. They both used digitally controlled oscillators. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a pure digital synthesizer. It's basically a hybrid synthesizer. It uses a digital clock to drive analog oscillators. That's what a DCO is. It's a very confusing term. Now, the JX-3P has two DCOs. Here's 1 and 2. In this particular preset, we've got a sawtooth on 1, a square on DCO 2. But then you have 6 voices to play with. If we jump into the options setting, you can see it defaults to 6 because out of the factory, that's what the JX-3P had. The reason it has 6 voices is also really interesting. It was originally a guitar synthesizer. The engine upon which the synthesizer is based was originally destined to be a guitar synth. And some bright spark in Roland realised that if you put a keyboard on top of this thing, it's going to sound amazing. And that's one of the reasons why the primary interface was so simple. It just wasn't designed, it wasn't intended to be a keyboard. But they realised that it sounded so good they could. And then later on, they came along and added the hardware PG200, which gave you this enormous flexibility to be able to generate these incredible sounds behind the scenes. Anyway, enough of the history lesson. Let's just get on and start playing with this thing. First thing that I'm going to do is turn DCO2 off, just to give us a chance of figuring out what this synthesizer is actually doing. Now, if I press a key, you can have a look in the oscilloscope. It's supposed to be generating a sawtooth, but it's not going to look anything like a sawtooth. So there's a lot of modulation, a lot of complexity to that sound. One of the reasons is because we have chorus engaged. The Roland chorus is one of the most glorious effects of all time, and it's perfectly entitled to have its very own button on the interface. But we're going to perform the sacrilegious act of turning off the chorus to help us get to the underlying sound. Let's have a look at the oscilloscope now. There you go, that's looking much more like a sawtooth now. We've still got an effect though. If you have a look down in the bottom right hand corner of the synthesizer, we've got this additional set of effects banks, and at the moment the delay is on. Let's turn that off. It's even simpler. So at this point, I just want to slow things down and start having a think about the architecture of the synthesizer. So what's going on when we press this note? Well, the note is being generated by an envelope. An envelope is simply a shape that defines how that sound is going to evolve over time. And on the right-hand side of the extension module, we have this little button that tells us how, when we press a key, that sound is going to get to the oscillators. It's actually coming from envelope 2. Here's envelope 2. So this is our attack, decay, sustain, release envelope, the simplest and most common of all types of envelopes. And it defines how long the sound is going to take to get from 0 to maximum, which is instant at the moment. If I increase the attack, it takes much longer to get there. And then we have a decay period over which we descend to the sustain level. And at the moment, the sustain level is set to 0. So when I press a key, it starts out loud and gets quieter and quieter until eventually it will get down to the sustain level. Finally, the release tells you what's going to happen when you let the key go. So now I let the key go and the sound lasts longer because I've introduced a release. So here's the ADSR envelope being tied in to the oscillators, and both oscillators are always live. In the source mix, you can see that at the moment oscillator 1 is on and oscillator 2 is off because I turned it off. Oscillator 1 is generating a sawtooth wave because that's what its waveform setting is, and our options are saw, square, pulse, which is basically a square wave with an offset duty cycle. A square wave is 50% on, 50% off, and a pulse wave is pretty much the same thing with those numbers changed. So in a pulse wave, you have a very wide duty cycle with a tiny bit of off. The range knob specifies your default octave. These numbers represent the length of an organ pipe, a church organ pipe. They're in feet, and they literally tell you how big a pipe would have to be to make a tone of a particular frequency. So if we go from 8 to 16 feet, we've doubled the length of the pipe. In other words, we're making a note 1 octave lower. And an octave lower again. And that's the only tuning control for DC01. There is, however, another master pitch control, and it's down at the bottom of the interface. We have a tuning knob over here. It defaults to 440 Hz, but you can basically make very minor changes to the pitch. If I turn this slightly, you can see very small changes. This is another really interesting historical quirk. In 1983, when this synthesizer was invented, it used 16-bit digital technology, and the digital oscillators that generated the tone weren't perfectly accurate, so they couldn't generate pitches that were absolutely pitch perfect. And so they had to introduce an analog tuning control, which is this knob down here, to basically adjust those things very slightly, so that if you wanted exactly 440 Hz out of your synthesizer, you could do it. The DCO circuitry on its own couldn't do that job alone, so it needed a little bit of help from the analog world. I think that's lovely. So anyway, here we've got our sawtooth wave. So what happens if I increase the sustain level to maximum? Does that mean we'll get maximum volume all the time? No, something else is working on this wave. So let's go another layer deep and figure out what. What's actually happening is that the high frequencies of this tone are being thrown away gradually over time. We have a second envelope in operation. Envelope 1 is doing this job. I'm going to change 2 controls on this interface now, the envelope 1 mod and the cutoff frequency. We change them very briefly and then come back and explain what's happened. I'm going to set the modulation to 12 o'clock, which basically means it's not doing anything. You can accomplish that on Roland synthesizers by pressing the control key on your keyboard and then clicking it with your mouse. It gets to 12 o'clock. And the cutoff frequency, I'm going to turn all the way up to maximum. Now I'm going to press the note on my keyboard. I'm getting a little bit of waviness at the moment. That's actually because we've got some reverb on this synthesizer. I'll turn the reverb off. And now we're basically going to get a completely pure sawtooth. So this synthesizer now, don't forget, that's still generating the digital representation of an analog synthesizer. The JX-3P used analog circuitry to generate these sounds. Its clock was digitally controlled. That's what a DCO is. It's only the speed of the oscillation that's controlled with a DCO. So what we've basically got here is this synthesizer's representation as close as it can get of a perfect sawtooth. Now these 2 knobs that I moved in order to accomplish that are the filter controls. So let's have a look at the filter. The filter circuit in the JX-3P is a resonant low-pass filter, which basically means that as I turn this knob from all the way clockwise to anti-clockwise, it's going to throw away an ever-increasingly large number of frequencies. You'll see it in the spectrum analyzer. Let's start off by playing all of the frequencies. This representation here is a sawtooth. Just turn it down a little bit. Now as I start pulling the cutoff frequency back, we throw away high frequency. Now that means the sound is going to get quieter. There's less harmonics in play now. There's less sound being generated. It gets quieter. But the fundamental, the lowest of all of the tones, is essentially unchanged. Eventually we get to the stage where we're actually attenuating the lowest note as well. But for most of the time, until the cutoff gets anywhere near the fundamental, the lowest of all of the tones, we're just throwing away all of the high frequency. So that's what our cutoff frequency does. But I changed 2 controls to get that stable sawtooth wave. I also changed the ENV1 mod. What's happening here is that this envelope, envelope 1, which has its own shape no attack, but it has quite a long decay, coming down to a sustain level of 83, just a random arbitrary number, something between 0 and 255. This shape is basically pulling that cutoff frequency down over time, and the envelope 1 mod control, which is this thing, is determining how much this envelope is being allowed to affect the cutoff frequency. In other words, how much this shape is being applied to our cutoff frequency. So as we increase it, you'll see the cutoff frequency change dynamically over time. There we go. All of those high frequencies are being thrown away. The lower I set the destination cutoff frequency, the more room this envelope has to play with. In other words, the further that journey can be. And so the more high frequencies are thrown away. And now we're getting pretty close to where that basic sound was that we started with. If I throw the preset away and come back to it, this is basically where we started. And I'll turn DCO2 back off, disengage the chorus, turn my effects off. That's what we've got. This is the envelope of the filter being applied to the sound. Well, that's an awful lot of information I've just thrown at you there. Let's pause and have a think about it for a moment. We have an oscillator. It's generating a sawtooth wave. We've proved that fundamentally that's a very simple shape. We got to the stage where we could see it in the oscilloscope. Then we start applying layers of modulation to that sound, things that are going to change it over time. Some of them have an instantaneous and immediate effect. Some of them evolve over a period. The envelopes are designed to evolve over this period of time. The attack gets you up to an initial level and the decay comes down, and then we settle out at a sustain level. All of that stuff is being done to either the volume, in the case of envelope 2, or the filter cutoff, in the case of envelope 1. And the way this interface is laid out is a little bit space constrained. You know, the controls are kind of lumped together, but quite clearly we've got a VCF. Here's the filter. So the controls in this section primarily going to be about controlling our tone. And then we've got a couple of oscillator sections. At the moment, we've just been looking at DCO1. We've got a volume section called the VCA, or voltage controlled amplifier. That's over on the right hand side. Let's bring the second oscillator back in, DCO2. This is generating a square wave. The combination of those two sounds together makes a much more complex shape. You can see in the oscilloscope we have fundamentally a square wave that's being modulated over time, and then the sawtooth, and we mix those two together in a much more complex shape. And so dual oscillator synthesizers have just got an enormous advantage over single oscillator synths. Every single note is making two different sounds and they're being mixed together. Let's finish off having a look at the VCF while we're here. We have this resonance control, which is going to boost particular frequencies around the cutoff frequency. So if I turn the cutoff frequency up to somewhere around halfway, Roland don't like to make specific statements about what the particular cutoff frequency is. But if you have a look in the oscilloscope, you can basically find it. And a good way to find it is by boosting the resonance, which is a spike that's going to be accentuated at the cutoff level. This that's traveling back through the wave, that's the cutoff frequency made manifest, made visible by increasing the resonance knob. If I turn resonance back down, we lose that spike and we have a smooth curve again. Resonance makes a feature of that cutoff. It really pokes it through the frequency spectrum. And so as it passes through the wave, as the modulation, the envelope modulation in this case, is sweeping that cutoff backwards, we get the classic filter sweep effect. Here it is. Now if I hold a key down and we listen to that sound for a moment, I know it's fading away to silence, but its pitch is also going up and down. Pitch modulation comes from the controls at the bottom left-hand side of the PG200. All of these lines pointing up into the two DCOs, you can see frequency modulation for DCOs 1 and 2. And one of the switches is set on. Here it is, frequency modulation, and we have the label LFO. That stands for low frequency oscillator. So something in these lower controls is modulating the pitch of DCO2, making it bounce up and down. Well, a low frequency oscillator is designed to do exactly that. That's its whole purpose in life. It's a very slow cycling wave that's designed to be plugged into other modules to modulate them in some way. And in this case, we're modulating the frequency or pitch of oscillator 2. How much modulation we get is going to be set from the LFO modulation control, LFO mod. So it was set to a very subtle level, which meant it was just vibratoing the sound very gently rather than doing that dramatic kind of science fiction effect. But this line is coming out of the LFO mod and going up into each of these two modulation inputs, but this one in DCO2 is on, and so the oscillator is being modulated. If I turn it off, tone is static. Let's modulate DCO1 instead. So now the sawtooth is going to have its pitch modulated, but the square wave will stay static. You can't really tell, it's very difficult to tell the difference between one static wave and one oscillating wave. All you can tell is the difference between them. If you A/B'd them very carefully, you'd be able to hear slight differences. Let's turn that back off again. This time, let's use the envelope to modulate pitch. Go back to oscillator 2, and I'm going to turn envelope modulation on. As we saw earlier, envelope 1 is down here, so these controls, not only are they applying to the VCF cutoff frequency via the env1 mod knob in the filter section, they also have the ability to apply pitch modulation. Let's turn some up. Just immediately being reminded of John Carpenter's Christine, fantastic soundtrack. That's exactly what he did. He had a constant tone in the background, synth tone, with a second oscillator descending in pitch over the top of it. Oh, wonderful film. So that's envelope modulation. And of course, there's nothing stopping us having both of those effects on simultaneously. If I turn the LFO modulation back on, so the envelope is sweeping, the LFO is oscillating. Both of those modulators are having an effect on the pitch. What's the shape of the LFO? Well, it's a sine wave. It's going up and down constantly. What happens if we turn it into a square wave instead? We have the waveform of the LFO has now just been turned into a square wave. It's going to have two levels, up and down. The envelope is traveling on its journey, and the LFO is doing a very constant, very static thing. Let's turn the envelope off for a moment. We'll just concentrate on the LFO. Now you've got an ambulance siren. Change the pitch of DCO2. Just increased it to 4 feet and it got higher. I've made so many changes to this preset, I'm going to throw it away and come back to the basic sound. And one last demonstration I'll give you today is using the LFO as a modulator on the filter cutoff instead. So this time I'm going to disable the envelope modulation by pressing Ctrl on my keyboard and just clicking envelope 1 mod. And this time I'm going to turn LFO mod up. So now the low frequency oscillator, whatever it happens to be doing, it's a sine wave cycling at a rate that's actually tied to Cubase at the moment. You can see that it's a dotted quarter note. If I wanted to make it a fixed rate, by the way, here's tempo sync. Let's just turn tempo sync off. Now we have an absolute BPM. So this LFO, this sine wave, is now going to modulate the filter cutoff. Let's have a listen to that. It's very quiet at the moment because the cutoff frequency is set quite low. I'm going to turn it up so the central point around where the cutoff frequency is going to oscillate is a little bit higher. There we go. And if I increase envelope 2 to prevent the sound from fading away, now you can hear the LFO operating around this frequency cutoff that I'm basically controlling the center point. Let's have a bit of resonance. Now you can hear that spike, that peak in the resonance. This is why I love these early 80s Roland synths so much. All of the sounds, it's just so easy to dial in something that sounds really cool. And I think we'll call it a day there. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks very much.